If you have been to a bookstore in the last like 3 years, which if you're watching this video, I assume you have, or even if you've watched my channel before, you will have noticed this trend. But there is a huge trend in the publishing industry right now of Greek mythological retellings. I talk about them a lot because I love Greek mythology, and this summer I spent a lot of time in Greece. I went to Patmos, Kalymnos, Lipsi, Corfu, Kos, Rhodes, Kefalonia, and then finally Ithaca. Okay, this is gonna be like my dumb moment, okay? This is my like himbo moment. I'm gonna be totally honest and transparent with you here and tell you I genuinely did not know until this summer that Ithaca was a real place. I thought it was just from mythology. I thought they were probably places that historians believed to be Ithaca, but I didn't realize that Ithaca itself was actually a real island. And then when I was in Kefalonia, I found out that you could do like a day trip to Ithaca. And so I was like, we have to do that. So that's exactly what I did. And Ithaca is the island where Homer's Odyssey is set, at least in part because the whole point of the Odyssey is that Odysseus is trying to get back to the island of Ithaca, of which he is king. His wife Penelope and his son Telemachus are both still on the island and have been while he was away at the Trojan War. He upsets the gods, they make it very difficult for him to get home, and so it takes him a very, very, very long time to get back to Ithaca. And I read the Odyssey when I was at university. I studied a module on Greek mythology. And in recent years, we have seen an absolute boom in the publishing industry of Greek mythological retellings. And so when I went to Ithaca, I read 3 books that are all about Ithaca, because inevitably with all of the Greek mythological retellings that exist, there will be some crossover because of course there is a finite number of Greek mythology stories to retell. And so I thought I would talk about them and how these books differ, how they overlap, and how I think they compare. So these are the 3 books. Firstly, we have the aptly named Ithaca by Claire North. We then have The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood and 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. I suppose you could also include in this list Circe by Madeline Miller, because that also retells part of the story of the Odyssey, but from Circe's perspective. So Odysseus came to her island and stayed with her. But these mostly retell the story of Penelope, who is Odysseus' wife, who stayed behind on Ithaca, and she's sort of painted within discourse as the loyal wife. She is almost like the patron of fidelity, because no matter how many potential suitors came in the hope of replacing Odysseus while he was away at sea, she remained faithful to her husband, and she rejected the advances of all of these suitors. She allowed them to live like on her island, and she was very hospitable to them. They would all eat in the Great Hall, and she basically said that she would weave this veil, and when she finished weaving the veil, that was when she would decide to marry someone else. And so every day she would spend the day weaving this veil, and then at night she would unpick all of the work that she had done. So every day she would basically start again afresh. And I guess that there is an example of how she is loyal to the end, and she is venerated for that. Now, these books take on a slightly different approach, which I thought was really interesting. But before I dive into talking about these books, I wanted to let you know that today's video is very, very kindly brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build your website or online brand with hundreds of incredible templates, so you don't need any coding experience, you don't need to be an expert web developer. You can use their templates as the perfect starting point and then customize them, make something that is completely your own, and bring to life the vision, the image of this website that you have in your head. There's really great features. For example, there's a blogging feature built into Squarespace so you can share what's going on behind the scenes and let your audience get to know you a little bit better. And then you can also use their expert analytical tool to see what is working really well, what the audience is responding to, and therefore what you should make more of. If this all sounds good, you can have a free trial over at squarespace.com where you can have a little play around and see what you can create. And then when you're ready to launch your beautiful new website, you can use the code JackInTheBooks at squarespace.com/JackInTheBooks to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. You're welcome, and thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Firstly, let's talk about The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. This was so fascinating because basically Margaret Atwood decided to use source material that was not Homer's Odyssey. So she investigated and researched the myth of Penelope whilst not rewriting Homer's Odyssey and not rewriting that same character who was just known purely for her loyalty. So this is Penelope's side of the story, and instead of just being this like devout, dedicated wife, devoted wife, it's about lust and greed and murder and being pretty pissed off. She kind of trash talks Odysseus. She also points out that Odysseus and Penelope had spent less time married than they had spent apart. And we get Penelope's perspective, and she's kind of like, do I even love this man who I barely even know at this point? And it also considers why Penelope would have had to act as a devoted wife because of what it would have done to her reputation if she wasn't. It's super, super irreverent, and it really takes a turn from the common kind of perception that we have of this character. It also focuses on Penelope's handmaids, 12 of which are killed, and in this book she gives them a kind of voice of like a chorus. So every now and then there's a section of poetry, and it's almost like an incantation, like a chant from these murdered women. And so I really loved how this book kind of flipped the story of Odysseus on its head, centering Penelope, thinking about what she would actually want, thinking about her desire, thinking about her feelings, thinking about her confusion in a way that is much less one-dimensional than how she is presented in Homer, for example. Now this book is really interesting, 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. Natalie Haynes is a comedian and classicist, and what this book seeks to do is to give voice to all of the different women who were impacted by the Trojan War. Now, I liked this book. I found it a little bit confusing at times in terms of how she formatted it, because it doesn't follow any kind of linear or chronological order. So it's not like we go through the chronology of Greek mythology and follow different specific women. It kind of jumps around a little bit, which is a little bit confusing. I personally felt like maybe it should have just started at the end of the Trojan War and then gone from there. And there are some things that follow chronology and other things where we bounce around to different points in time in the Greek mythological kind of canon. So I thought the structure was a little bit messy, but the writing and the stories themselves are so good that it is forgivable. And actually I would say the weakest part of this story is where it covers Penelope. So in this book, Penelope is one of the only characters that we return to lots of times. Lots of the stories in here are dealt with. It's almost like a collection of short stories. And most of the retellings are just one chapter with a set of characters, and then we never hear from them again, and then we move on to a different set of characters and a different kind of feminist retelling of their stories. But Penelope is kind of sprinkled throughout, so Penelope is one of the only characters who we keep returning to, and I honestly think that Penelope might have been the weakest part of this book, because I don't necessarily think it gives too much added depth to what she was kind of going through. So basically, the Penelope sections of 1,000 Ships feature Penelope speaking directly to Odysseus, and she seems to be sort of hearing rumours about his behaviour, which isn't necessarily historically accurate. But for the sake of this story, she is hearing rumours about all of the different things that Odysseus was getting up to on his way back to Ithaca, and she's getting pretty annoyed. There's this kind of like passive aggressiveness to the way that she addresses him, and you can tell that she's quite like bitter and confused too. She's kind of like, why aren't you coming home? Why are you doing all of these things? Why are you going off on all these side quests and meeting all these other women and doing all these other things, whereas I'm waiting here for you? I thought that was interesting. It wasn't my favourite part of the book, but I would still highly encourage you to pick up this book because there are so many killer retellings of other Greek myths, which pack such a punch, and you get so many different moods and characters. You know, some of the stories are really sad, some of them are really funny, others are tragic and shocking, and some are really innovative. So I really loved this book, but actually weirdly and ironically, the part that I liked the least was the Penelope retellings, because I don't think it really necessarily added anything new, any new texture to the character of Penelope. And then this book is just crazy in terms of what it does with the myth. So basically this takes the story of Ithaca and the island that Odysseus and Penelope were from, and while Odysseus is away, it basically imagines everything else. Not just Penelope waiting for Odysseus to return home, but like day-to-day life on the island and the other things that would happen. And there's this whole cast of characters who inhabit Ithaca and the surrounding islands. And it's important to remember too that on Ithaca, Penelope was not the only person, not the only woman left without her husband. Pretty much all of the men of Ithaca of a certain age left to go and fight in the Trojan War, and basically none of them returned. And so this book thinks about what it would be like to be living on an island where all of these women have essentially lost their husbands, and a bunch of new suitors have arrived on said island, but there's also loads of other things too. They interact with other characters like Electra, and what's fascinating about this story is that it's told from the perspective of Zeus's wife Hera, who famously in Greek mythology is like this bitter, angry woman who is just always wreaking havoc because she's just so mad at all of the shit that her husband does. She's always kind of seeking revenge and making other people's lives hell, and it was really interesting to read from her perspective and see her be characterized as a narrator. It's not that consistent, I have to say. Like, sometimes it's really witty and darkly funny, and Hera's voice really is the highlight of this book, but it's kind of few and far between. Like, there are some chapters where her voice is really strong and apparent, and other chapters where she's pretty absent. So there wasn't a strong voice, I think, or narrative voice. There wasn't a strong narrative voice because it kind of dipped in and out a little bit. It really fluctuated, but really interesting to see what you can do, what you can kind of extrapolate from one myth. I would say out of the three of these, this one is the closest to Homer's Odyssey. Then we have this one, but you know, there's a big jump between these two. And then Ithaca is just totally different. This is an entirely new story, which takes inspiration from Greek mythology, but also really has fun with it. Just finished filming and realized I forgot to mention that this is actually part of a series. So I think this is called like the House of Penelope or the House of Odysseus series. Will I be reading more? No. But I did like this one. I just think that this was enough for me. I don't need to read another one in this series, but I really did enjoy this. And so I thought it was fascinating to see how three different authors could tell the same story in three entirely different ways. And I also wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to these Greek mythological retellings. So thank you so much for watching this video. Those were my thoughts. As I said, Circe is also great. That's a good kind of addition to these three books. And I'd love to know if you've also read any other retellings of this same myth and legend. Let me know. Thanks so much for watching. All the best. Stay in touch. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.